Catch-22 is a satirical novel by the American author Joseph Heller. He began writing it in 1953. The novel was first published in 1961. It is frequently cited as one of the greatest literary works of the 20th century. It uses a distinctive non-chronological third-person omniscient narration, describing events from the points of view of different characters. The separate storylines are out of sequence so that the timeline develops along with the plot. The novel is set during World War II, from 1942 to 1944. It mainly follows the life of Captain John Yossarian, U.S. Army Air Force's B-25 bombardier. Most of the events in the book occur while the fictional 256th Squadron is based on the island of Pianosa in the Mediterranean Sea, west of Italy. The novel looks into the experiences of Yossarian and the other airmen in the camp, who attempt to maintain the sanity while fulfilling the service requirements so that they may return home. The novel's title refers to a plot device that is repeatedly invoked in the story. Catch-22 starts as a set of paradoxical requirements whereby airmen mentally unfit to fly did not have to do so, but could not actually be excused. By the end of the novel it is invoked as the explanation for many unreasonable restrictions. The phrase Catch-22 has since entered the English language, referring to a type of unsolvable logic puzzle sometimes called a double bind. According to the novel, people who were crazy were not obliged to fly missions, but anyone who plied to stop flying was showing a rational concern for his safety and, therefore, was sane. Synopsis. The plotline follows the airmen of the 256th Squadron while in action over Italy, and the repeated attempts to avoid combat missions that appear to lead to certain death. Their attempts are almost always comical, when an officer refers to the string on a map representing the front line and states that they won't be able to fly if it moves beyond the target. The airmen begin watching the string obsessively until Yossarian secretly moves the string and a mission is cancelled. The officer is not amused, and assigns them a particularly dangerous mission. The ultimate escape is to have oneself declared mentally unfit for duty, but the army has made this impossible through the eponymous Catch-22. In spite of the best efforts, most of the airmen are killed over the span of the novel. The development of the novel can be split into segments. The first broadly follows the story fragmented between characters, but in a single chronological time in 1944. The second flashes back to focus primarily on the Great Big Siege of Bologna, before once again jumping to the chronological present of 1944 in the third part. The fourth flashes back to the origins and growth of Milo's syndicate, with the fifth part returning again to the narrative present but keeping to the same tone of the previous four. In the sixth and final part remains in the present time but takes so much darker turn and spends the remaining chapters focusing on the serious and brutal nature of war and life in general. Previously the reader had been cushioned from experiencing the full horror of events, but in the final section the events are laid bare. The horror begins with the attack on the undefended Italian mountain village, with the following chapters involving despair, disappearance in combat, disappearance caused by the army, a death of most of Yossarian's friends, culminating in the unspeakable horrors of Chapter 39, in particular the rape and murder of Michaela, who represents pure innocence. In Chapter 41, the full details of the gruesome death of Snowden are finally revealed. Despite this, the novel ends on an upbeat note, with Yossarian learning of Orr's miraculous escape to Sweden and Yossarian's pledge to follow him there. Style. Many events in the book are repeatedly described from differing points of view, so the reader learns more about each event event from each iteration, with the new information often completing a joke, the punchline of which was told several chapters previously. The narrative's events are out of sequence, but events are referred to as if the reader is already familiar with them, so that the reader must ultimately piece together a timeline of events. Specific words, phrases, and questions are also repeated frequently, generally to comic effect. Much of Heller's prose in Catch-22 is circular and repetitive, exemplifying in its form the structure of a Catch-22. Circular reasoning is widely used by some characters to justify their actions and opinions. Heller revels in paradox. For example, the Texan turned out to be good-natured, generous and likable. In 3 days no one could stand him, and the case against Clevinger was open and shut. The only thing missing was something to charge him with. Quote, "This atmosphere of apparently logical or irrationality pervades the book. While a few characters are most prominent, notably Yossarian and the chaplain, the majority of named characters are described in detail with fleshed-out to multi-dimensional personas to the extent that there are few, if any, minor characters. Although its non-chronological structure may at first seem random, Catch-22 is highly structured. It is founded on a structure of free association. Ideas run into one another through seemingly random connections. For example, Chapter 1, entitled "The Texan," ends with everybody but the Sid man, who had caught cold from the fighter captain and come down with pneumonia. Chapter 2, entitled "Clevinger," begins with, "In a way the Sid man was pretty lucky, because outside the hospital the war was still going on." The Sid man connects the two chapters like a free association bridge, and eventually Chapter 2 flows from the Sid man to Clevinger through more free association links. Yossarian comes to fear his commanding officers more than he fears the Germans attempting to shoot him down, and he feels that they are out to get him. Chief among the reasons Yossarian fears his commanders more than the enemy is that as he flies more missions, Colonel Cathcart increases the number of required combat missions before a soldier may return home. He reaches the magic number only to have it retroactively raised. He comes to despair of ever getting home and is greatly relieved when he is sent to the hospital for a condition that is almost jaundice. In Yossarian's words, the enemy is anybody who's going to get you killed, no matter which side he's on, and that includes Colonel Cathcart. And don't you forget that, because the longer you remember it, the longer you might live. While the military's enemies are Germans, none appear in the story as an enemy combatant. This ironic situation is epitomized in the single appearance of German personnel in the novel, who act as pilots employed by the squadron's mess officer, Milo Minderbinder, to bomb the American encampment on Pianosa. This predicament indicates a tension between traditional motives for violence and the modern economic machine, which seems to generate violence simply as another means to profit, quite independent of geographical or ideological constraints. Heller emphasizes the danger of profit-seeking by portraying Milo without evil intent. Milo's actions are portrayed as the result of greed, not malice. Characters, influences. Heller wanted to be a writer from an early age. His experiences as a bombardier during World War II inspired Catch-22. Heller later said that he never had a bad officer. Quote, in a 1977 essay on Catch-22, Heller stated that the anti-war and anti-government feelings in the book were a product of the Korean War and the 1950s rather than World War II itself. Heller's criticisms are not intended for World War II but for the Cold War and McCarthyism. The influence of the 1950s on Catch-22 is evident through Heller's extensive use of anachronism. Though the novel is ostensibly set in World War II, Heller intentionally included anachronisms like loyalty oaths and computers to situate the novel in the context of the 1950s. Many of the characters are based on a connection connected to individuals from the 1950s. Milo Minderbinder's maxim, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for the country," alludes to former president of General Motors Charles Erwin Wilson's statement before the Senate, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." The question of who promoted Major alludes to Joseph McCarthy's questioning of the promotion of Major Perez, an army dentist who refused to sign loyalty oaths. Czech writer Arnost Luster recounts in his book 3/18 that Joseph Heller told him that he would never have written Catch-22 had he not first read The Good Soldier Svejk by Jaroslav Hasek. In 1998, some critics raised the possibility that Heller's book had questionable similarities to Louis Falstein's 1950 novel, Face of a Hero. Falstein never raised the issue between Catch-22's publication and his death in 1995, and Heller claimed never to have been aware of the obscure novel. Heller said that the novel had been influenced by Celine War and Nabokov. Many of the similarities have been stated to be attributable to the author's experiences, both having served as U.S. Army Air Force's aircrew in Italy in World War II. However, the themes and styles are different. Concept. Strictly speaking, a Catch-22 bullshit, a problematic situation for which the only solution is denied by a circumstance inherent in the problem or by a rule. For example, losing something is typically a conventional problem. To solve it, one looks for the lost item until one finds it. But if the thing lost is one's glasses, one can't see to look for them. A Catch-22. The term Catch-22 is also used more broadly to mean a tricky problem or a no-win or absurd situation. In the book, Catch-22 is a military rule typifying bureaucratic operation and reasoning. The rule is not stated in a general form, but the principal example in the book fits the definition above. If one is crazy, one does not have to fly missions, and one must be crazy to fly. But one has to apply to be excused, and applying demonstrates that one is not crazy. As a result, one must continue flying, either not applying to be excused, or applying and being refused. The narrator explains, there was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that concern for one's safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind, or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask, and as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions, or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't, but if he were sane he had to fly them. If he flew them he was crazy and didn't have to, but if he didn't want to he was sane and had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of Catch-22 and let out a respectful whistle. Other forms of Catch-22 are invoked throughout the novel to justify various bureaucratic actions. At one point, victims of harassment by military police quote the MP's explanation of one of Catch-22's provisions. Catch-22 states that agents enforcing Catch-22 need not prove that Catch-22 actually contains whatever provision the accused violator is accused of violating. Another character explains, Catch-22 says they have a right to do anything we can't stop them from doing. Yossarian comes to realize that Catch-22 does not actually exist, but because the powers that be claim it does, and the world believes it does, it nevertheless has potent effects. Indeed, because it does not exist, there is no way it can be repealed, undone, overthrown, or denounced. The combination of force with specious and spurious legalistic justification is one of the book's primary motifs. The motif of bureaucratic absurdity is further explored in 1994's Closing Time, Heller's sequel to Catch-22. This darker, slower-paced, apocalyptic novel explores the pre- and post-war lives of some of the major characters in Catch-22, with particular emphasis on the relationship between Yossarian and tale gunner Sammy Singer. Literary allusions. Catch-22 contains allusions to many works of literature. Howard Jacobson, in his 2004 introduction to the Vintage Classics publication, wrote that the novel was positioned teasingly between literature and literature's opposites, between Shakespeare and Rabelais and Dickens and Dostoevsky and Gogol and Celine and the absurdists and of course Kafka on the one hand, and on the other vaudeville and slapstick and Bilko and Abbott and Costello and Tom and Jerry and the Goons. One critic argues that it is Kafka's influence that can be seen most strongly in the novel. Like Kafka's heroes, Yossarian is riddled with anxiety and caught in an inexorable nightmare, in his case created by Colonel Cathcart and the inevitability of his raising the number of missions he has to fly. Historical context. The idea for Catch-22 was based on Joseph Heller's personal experience in World War II. The feelings that Yossarian and the other bomber pilots felt were taken directly from problems he suffered while on duty. Heller flew 60 bombing missions from May to October in 1944. Heller mentions that he should have been killed 3 times over, since the average death rate was 5% per mission. Heller was able to make it out of the war, but the experience tortured him and it took until 1953 before he could start writing about it. The war experience turned Heller into a tortured, funny, deeply peculiar human being. After publication in 1961, Catch-22 became very popular among teenagers at the time. Catch-22 seemed to embody the feelings that young people had toward the Vietnam War. It was joked around that every student who went off to college at the time took along a copy of Catch-22. The popularity of the book created a cult following, which led to over 8 million copies being sold in the United States. There are many who feel that the comic fable that ends in horror has become more and more clearly a reflection of the altogether uncomic and horrifying realities of the world in which we live and hope to survive. Explanation of the novel's title. The title is a reference to a fictional bureaucratic stipulation which embodies forms of illogical and immoral reasoning. The opening chapter of the novel was originally published in New World Writing as Catch-18 in 1955, but Heller's agent, Candida Donadio, requested that he change the title of the novel so it would not be confused with another recently published World War II novel, Leon Uris's Miller 18. The number 18 has special meaning in Judaism and was relevant to early drafts of the novel which had a somewhat greater Jewish emphasis. The title Catch-11 was suggested, with the duplicated one paralleling the repetition found in a number of character exchanges in the novel, but because of the release of the 1960 movie Ocean's 11, this was also rejected. Catch-17 was rejected so as not to be confused with the World War II film Stalag 17, as was Catch-14, apparently because the publisher did not feel that 14 was a funny number. Eventually the title came to be Catch-22, which, like 11, has a duplicated digit, with the 2 also referring to a number of acute J-Avu-like events common in the novel. Publication and movie rights. Catch-22 was sold to Simon & Amp Schuster, where it had been championed by editor Robert Gottlieb, who along with Nina Bourne, would edit and oversee the marketing of the book. Gottlieb was a strong advocate for the title along with Peter Schwed and Justin Kaplan. Henry Simon, a vice president at Simon & Amp Schuster, found it repetitive and offensive. The editorial board decided to contract the book when Heller agreed to revisions. He signed for $1,500. Officially published on the 10th of October 1961, the hardcover sold for $5.95. The book was not a bestseller in hardcover in the United States. Though it sold 12,000 copies by Thanksgiving, it never entered the New York Times bestseller list. Catch-22 received good notices and was nominated for the National Book Award in March 1962. It went through 4 printings in hardcover, but only sold well on the East Coast. The book never established itself nationally until it was published in paperback for 75 cents. Upon publication in Great Britain, the book became the #1 bestseller. Don Fine of Dell Paperbacks bought the paperback reprint rights to Catch-22 for $32,000. Between the paperback's release in September 1962 and April 1963, it sold 1.1 million copies. In August 1962, Don Adio brokered the sale of movie rights to Columbia Pictures for $100,000 plus $25,000 to write a treatment or a first draft of a screenplay. Reception. The initial reviews of the book ranged from very positive to very negative. There were positive reviews from The Nation, the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times. On the other hand, The New Yorker and a second review from the New York Times disliked it. One commentator of Catch-22 recognized that many early audiences liked the book for just the same reasons that caused others to hate it. The book had a cult following though, especially among teenagers and college students. Heller remarks that in 1962, after appearing on the Today Show, he went out drinking with the host at the time, John Chancellor, who handed him stickers that Chancellor got privately printed reading "YOSSARIN Lives." Heller also said that Chancellor had been secretly putting them on the walls of the corridors and executive bathrooms in the NBC building. Although the novel won no awards upon release, it has remained in print and is seen as one of the most significant American novels of the 20th century. Scholar and fellow World War II veteran Hugh Nibley said it was the most accurate book he ever read about the military. Since its release in 1961, the book has sold 10 million copies. Rankings. The Modern Library ranked Catch-22 as the 7th and 12th greatest English-language novel of the 20th century. The Radcliffe Publishing Course ranked Catch-22 as number 15 of the 20th century's top 100 novels. The Observer listed Catch-22 as one of the 100 greatest novels of all time. Time puts Catch-22 in the top 100 English-language modern novels. The Big Read by the BBC ranked Catch-22 as number 11 on a web poll of the UK's best-loved book. Adaptations. Catch-22 was adapted into a feature film of the same name in 1970, directed by Mike Nichols. Catch-22 play. Aquila Theatre produced a stage adaptation of Catch-22, based on Heller's 1971 stage adaptation. It was directed by Peter Miner. This production toured the USA in 2007/8 with a Bexhill-on-Sea production in the fall of 2008. A pilot for a comedy series based upon Catch-22 was made and televised in 1973, with Richard Dreyfuss in the starring role of Captain Yossarian. Selected releases. This list covers the first and most recent printed publications by the original publisher Simon & Amp Schuster, as well as all other formats. Other print publishers include Dell, Corgi, Vintage, Knopf, Black Swan, Grasset & Amp, Fasquelle, and Wallstrom & Amp Widstron. The original manuscript is held by Brandeis University. 1961. Simon & Amp Schuster, ISBN 0-671-128051, pub date June 1961, hardback. 1961. Simon & Amp Schuster, ISBN 0-440-51120-8, advance paperback with signed bookplate. 1978. Franklin Library, ISBN 0-8124-1717-8, signed limited edition leather-bound. 1996. Simon & Amp Schuster, ISBN 0-684-83339-5, pub date September 1996, paperback. 1999. Simon & Amp Schuster, ISBN 0-684-86513-0, pub date October 1999, hardback. 1980. Books on tape, ISBN 0-7366-8962-1, unabridged audio cassette reader Wolfram Kandinsky. 1984. Cadman Audio, ISBN 0-694-50253-7, audio cassette. 1990. Books on tape, ISBN 0-7366-90859, unabridged audio CD reader Jim Weiss. 1994. DH Audio, ISBN 0-88646-1251, abridged edition audio cassette reader Alan Arkin. 2007. Cadman ISBN 978-006-126246-3, unabridged audio CD reader J.O. Sanders. 2008. Hachette Audio, ISBN 978-1-4055-03877-7, unabridged audio CD reader Trevor White.